Hello, good morning, good afternoon to our audience joining us from various time zones. I'm Raymond Kerr, I'm the Chief Program and Development Officer here at AGSIW. We're happy to be hosting the launch of this new publication titled Low Carbon Energy in the Middle East and North Africa. And we have with us the two editors of the book, along with one of its authors, to speak about their new book and help us explore the transition to renewable and low carbon energy in the Middle East. With that, I'm happy to now introduce our wonderful panel of experts, starting with Li-Chen, Assistant Professor at Khalifa University of Science and Technology in Abu Dhabi. She is a specialist in the political economy of Russian and Gulf energy, oil, gas, renewables, and nuclear, and its intersection with international relations. Her interests include the politics of renewable and nuclear energy in the Middle East, Gulf-Asia exchanges, Russia-China relations in the Middle East, and Russia-Gulf interactions. Also with us is our good friend Robin Mills, non-resident fellow at AGSIW and CEO of Qamar Energy. He established Qamar Energy in 2015 to meet the need for regionally based Middle East energy insight. He is an expert on energy strategy and economics, a fellow at Columbia University Center on Global Energy Policy, and senior fellow of the Iraq Energy Institute. He is a columnist for The National and Bloomberg, and is the author of a report on Middle East solar titled Sunrise in the Desert, and two books, The Myth of the Oil Crisis and Capturing Carbon. Last but not least, Faris Al-Sulayman, a research fellow at the King Faisal Center for Research on Islamic Studies in Riyadh, and a PhD candidate at the London School of Economics, where his research focuses on state capitalism and energy transitions in the Gulf. He's also a co-founder and executive director of Hala Energy, a solar engineering, procurement, and construction company and developer working at the commercial and industrial scale in Saudi Arabia. So not only a scholar, but a practitioner as well. That's great. Moderating the session today is Kate Dourian, a non-resident fellow at AGSIW and contributing editor at the Middle East Economic Survey and a fellow at the Energy Institute. Previously, she was the regional manager for the Middle East and Gulf states at the World Energy Council, as well as a program officer for Middle East and North Africa at the International Energy Agency. With that, Kate, over to you.
Thank you, Raymond. Thank you very much. I'm really happy to be moderating this panel discussion because I think this book is quite unique. I mean, I haven't actually seen such an extensive, tracking of the sort of renewables and low carbon energy projects in the MENA region. We get patchy. We hear a lot about, oh, they have the biggest solar park in the world being built in Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Morocco. But a sort of a regional look, I mean, when I look at the IEA's renewable energy reports, I don't really see much about the Middle East. So, and I was actually quite, it struck me when I read the book that, despite all the hype that we hear about the progress of these renewable energy projects, mainly solar in the UAE, Morocco, that low carbon sources account for only 11.1% of electricity generation, which is the lowest among all regions of the world in MENA. And of course, because it's not evenly, I mean, the resources are pretty much evenly distributed. We have wind and solar in Saudi Arabia, Iraq, but at the same time, the deployment has been uneven. You have countries like Iraq, which has barely started with solar. They have hydropower, but that's also risky because of dam building in Turkey. And in the UAE, you have sort of clean energy credentials that they would like to advertise, and they do. They make a big noise about them, but at the same time, they have coal. Dubai is about to start operating a so-called clean coal power plant, which isn't really that clean. So that sort of, but they're keeping it pretty quiet. Then we have countries like Jordan, the energy poor, the oil poor countries like Jordan, which has done more with its renewables. And of course, we have Saudi Arabia, which is now catching up, having set some very, very high targets and then reduced them, and then having now established the stakeholders who are going to be in charge of renewables. It's moving ahead. Of course, we have NEOM, we have the world's largest green hydrogen plant that is being planned there. We have, solar wind projects. And then, of course, we have nuclear in the UAE. and in Iran, but for different reasons. You know, the race to develop a nuclear energy in Iran. And I was also quite surprised to see that it only accounts for 1 gigawatts. So it's more a sort of political, more for a sense of pride for Iran to develop nuclear capability as opposed to the UAE, which actually does have very long-term plans. And the other thing that struck me is that, you know, there's little coordination within the UAE and also within the region. I mean, you would think that with all the gas resources of Qatar and Iran that you would have, and now, of course, the East Mediterranean, that there would be more of an effort to have a more regional grid, because it's all about energy security. The UAE wants to have, wants to be independent, self-sufficient in gas. Saudi Arabia putting 100 billion in unconventionals, and yet there isn't a common gas grid. The electricity grid, yes, the GCC is working, but it doesn't really operate to its full capacity. So, and it's also timely in that yesterday the IEA issued its pathway to net zero by 2050. And it does admit that this is actually going to mean that the oil and gas producers are going to be hurt if the pathway is adopted by the major economies in the world, the major consumers. And it says that in order to reach the 2050 net zero target, you have to stop investing in oil and gas, upstream oil and gas and coal from today. And, you know, stop selling internal combustion engine cars from 2035. And it says that the MENA region could stand to see a reduction in their net income from oil and gas, so around 70% by 2030s and 80% by 2050. I mean, that must be quite scary. So I wanted to ask you, do you think that they started a bit too late? And are we going to see an acceleration of this drive to sort of lower carbon economies and less dependence for social, political, economic reasons on oil and gas? And I will give the floor to Robin first to kick off the conversation. Thanks, Robin.
Yes, thanks, Kate. Thanks very much for the introduction. So I'd like to, you know, as you say, Kate, address particularly the role of Iran and Iraq. I think they're two very interesting case studies, and they're two of the ones that are maybe not addressed so much when we talk about the region's drive for low carbon energy. And yet they are two large countries with large power demand. So they really stand out, and they're also quite unique and unusual in their politics in different ways. So Raymond, if you could put the slides that I'll speak to. Great, thank you very much. So first of all, you know, looking at the contribution of the low carbon generation capacity in Iran and Iraq compared to a couple of the peers, you notice that taking here, you know, UAE and Egypt, Kate just mentioned a bit about the UAE's nuclear and solar plans and indeed progress to date. Really stands out that Iran has a large amount of hydropower, but it has very little of, let's say, the new renewable solar and wind, although it has excellent resources of both. Iraq, you know, even more so, no wind power and a very limited amount of solar power, a bit of hydro, not a large amount. And Iraq, of course, has not developed nuclear power. Iran has, but only to a very limited extent, despite a lot of effort. And the UAE, you know, you could say that UAE maybe started in this journey much later, particularly on the nuclear side, but already has already overtaken Iran and installed nuclear generating capacity, and will have more than 5 times as much in the next few years, and already has substantially more solar. Now, Egypt, another large country, kind of comparable, even larger population than Iran, and it has substantially more installed solar and also wind power. So this kind of stands out as a bit of a curiosity, you know, why these two admittedly hydrocarbon rich, you know, relatively large countries, which both have problems with power shortages, and at least in the case of Iran, have quite a substantial domestic industrial and technical capability, have not really been able to move ahead with low carbon energy to the extent that they might have been expected to. So next slide, please. For Iraq, I think it's the explanation is fairly straightforward. You know, we know Iraq has had a very turbulent political history, especially since 1980, a series of wars, invasions, sanctions, political upheaval, near effective civil war, at times severe problems with security and violence. And so not surprising that Iraq has really struggled. No surprise that it never really made an attempt at nuclear power, apart from a few expressions of interest. It did, of course, under Saddam Hussein, have some ambitions of possibly in a nuclear weapons program, which were strongly opposed by the US, but no real ambitions on nuclear power generation. However, Iraq suffers from terrible electricity shortages that over the past year or so have actually, if anything, got worse. And so there seemed to be a lot of room for the new renewables, for electricity generation from solar and wind power in particular. Iraq has excellent solar resources, has good wind resources in some areas. And yes, as we showed, almost nothing installed to date. And really, that's a combination of a few factors. Firstly, the turbulent legacy. Secondly, corruption and mismanagement. I mean, Iraq struggles to really advance projects, even in the oil and gas space, and really across its whole economy. So doing anything new in energy is even more challenging. There are vested interests, the so-called generator mafia. It's a phenomenon you have in Lebanon as well, but really operators of neighborhood diesel generators who benefit from subsidized diesel supplies, and who therefore actually benefit from the power situation being so bad. They're able to sell their high-priced electricity to consumers, and they're therefore effectively able to oppose any reform of the sector. And the electricity sector just being financially unsustainable itself, which makes it very hard to stand behind power purchase agreements for solar, wind, other low-carbon electricity, which the UAE, for example, has done with great success in reducing the cost of financing. So the electricity sector, it loses about 40% of generation in technical losses in the network, another 20% non-technical, which is a fancy word for theft, unauthorized connections. And even the customers who pay, they only pay about 10% of the true cost of generation. So the electricity sector has to be propped up by the state budget, can't act independently, and finds it very hard to advance renewable energy projects. There have been a series of tenders for renewable energy. We're hopeful the latest one may finally move forward, but progress has been painfully slow given the potential and the urgent need. And on the hydroelectricity side, there are various complications as well, not just relating to the big projects, but there are a number of existing hydroelectric dams. They haven't been rehabilitated since the US invasion, produce well below their capacity. There are water shortages upstream because of the dam building, particularly in Turkey and also in Iran. And there are political issues within Iraq. So several of new planned dams would be in the Kurdish region, and therefore that they don't attract financing from the central government. And there's also concerns over giving the Kurdistan region too much control over water flows into the rest of Iraq. So this explains really why the hydro sector has struggled to get rehabilitated since 2003. Next slide, please. Iran is a more complicated picture than this. Iran has had this persistent commitment to the nuclear program, and by this I mean there's a nuclear power program, which is in some extent connected to the nuclear enrichment program, which has caused Iran so many problems with sanctions and political confrontation with the US and others. There is a link between those two, but not an inextricable link, of course. Iran has installed one operating nuclear reactor at Bashar on the Gulf Coast. That was started by the Germans back in 1974 under the Shah. The project was suspended following the revolution. Then eventually it was picked up by the Russians and completed and began generating in 2013. So a very long history, a very expensive history, which has resulted in about 1 gigawatt of installed generation, which is about a little bit over 1% of Iran's total generation capacity. So a huge amount of political controversy and expense and trouble for very little reward. Now Iran has some plans for new nuclear reactors, with Russians, possibly with Chinese backing. Those may well go ahead, but the results so far have been very limited. And yet the political commitment to the nuclear program has been extremely strong, both under the Shah's government and under the Islamic Republic. And this is a matter of various factors. One is a belief in nuclear power. In the 1970s era, a belief in nuclear power as a sign of modernity and technical progress. Another is a nationalist side of wanting to persist with the nuclear program in the face of particularly US-led opposition. Another part of it is, there have been genuine concerns over Iran's energy security, particularly in the 70s when it wasn't clear that Iran had as much gas as we now know it does. There are concerns that its oil resources would be exhausted, that there did seem to be a genuine need for new power generation. Again, in the early 2000s, when Iran was also short of gas and was arguing over what it should do with the gas that it had, replacing it in the power sector seemed to make sense. But more recently, with the advance of renewables, very questionable whether such a problematic program makes economic sense, but it continues to have political backing. And hydropower, you'll notice that, as I showed, Iran does have a lot of hydropower installed, and that's also because it has institutional and political backing. The Revolutionary Guards and their engineering, Khatam al-Anbiya, the Revolutionary Guards-backed construction company, wins a lot of the contracts for constructing these dams. So it's financially interesting for them to be involved. And there's also political backing, so by local politicians, MPs, and so on, who can bring water and bring investment to their district in terms of building dams. That's also attractive to them as well. And so hydropower gets built, and yes, it's a form of low carbon energy. It can be cost competitive, but in Iran, it really struggles with poorly sited dams, poorly designed dams, lack of water. Iran is of course, a relatively water short country. And so these dams, especially as the better sites have been used up, new dams have become increasingly problematic. And it's notable that under the Rouhani government since 2015, that he has very much avoided spending on or completing any new dams. Hasn't made a big point of it because without wanting to seem to challenge the Revolutionary Guards openly, but his administration has clearly sought to remove that source of patronage by slowing down the spending on dams and also recognizing the environmental irresponsibility of some of these plans. The solar and wind program has made only very limited progress. And again, really because unlike the nuclear and hydro programs, it lacks an institutional backer. The responsibility for renewables and the budget for it is dispersed amongst numerous entities, none of them politically very strong. International companies have been very interested in working on Iranian renewables at various times, but of course they've been deterred by sanctions. Several large projects led by European firms, including UK and Norwegian firms, have been cancelled because those companies didn't feel able to go ahead under the condition of sanctions, even though you would think that giving Iran an alternative to nuclear power would be a reasonable objective of US policy. And investment conditions for renewables, for non-hydro renewables, have been unattractive. They're bureaucratic, it's hard to obtain land, it's hard to obtain electricity connections to the grid. The conditions for payment, they look good on paper, but they have a lot of practical problems, such as currency conversion. And so put this all together, and the projects that have been done are small. So Iran's solar and wind projects are 10, 20 megawatt projects individually, which obviously just doesn't bear comparison with the 1 to 2 gigawatt projects that are being done by their neighbors. Now, Iran has huge potential for this, and perhaps if these current nuclear talks bear some fruit, we may see again a lot of interest in developing renewables in Iran. However, that really depends on not just on the access to international investment, but on the domestic climate for renewables being more supportive and having more institutional backing and a home for it. So last slide, please. So just to show a couple of illustrations of this problem, on the left, you've got the Semara Dam in Ilam province in the west of Iran. And this has been under construction for 17 years, pretty long time, by Revolutionary Guards linked companies. And this area lacks water. And so this dam has been seriously challenged as a kind of a white elephant that it may look pretty full in the picture, but it's not as full as that in reality. And so an example of one of these very long and expensive projects, which is not going to yield the results that should be desired. And on the right, the Bashar nuclear plant, as I mentioned, 1,000 megawatts, so pretty small for all that effort. 39 years start to finish. I mean, to be fair, not all of that was spent in construction, but still an incredibly long period. and a direct cost of $11 billion. That's ignoring the indirect cost of sanctions and all the various other problems that are related to the nuclear program. But so for $11 billion, Iran is getting 1,000 megawatts of generation. The UAE's nuclear program costing somewhat over $22 billion, about twice the cost, but getting almost 6 times the generation. And obviously in a far shorter time, about 10 years, start to finish. So really a very strong contrast in the decision-making, and interesting how the institutional factors have really overcome or outweighed the commercial or economic logic in these cases. So thank you. I'll hand back to Kate.
Thank you. And my apologies, Li-Chen. I think you were supposed to go first and introduce the book. So maybe there is still so much more in the book. So I'm going to pass it on to you. And apologies again.
No worries at all, Kate. You're the boss, so you tell us what you want us to speak about. So Raymond, if you could, the beginning of the slides, please. Thank you for your very generous words about the book, Kate. We had wanted to do something that was, as you said, a bit unique. And so, when we looked at the MENA region, as you correctly pointed out, the traditional view, next slide, please, is of the MENA region as a separation between the haves and the have-nots in terms of oil. Could you go to the next slide, please? Right, thank you. So as you can see, have and have-nots, that's one traditional variation in MENA. But when it comes to low carbon energy, the distinction is not that clear, because all of the countries have, in some capacity or the other, a way to have renewable low carbon energy, whether it's CSP solar or PV solar or wind or hydropower or nuclear. They all can have some form of low carbon energy. But as Robin has mentioned, and as you have mentioned, Kate, there are varying degrees of success, varying degrees of success in terms of scope as well as pace. So we decided to take a look further into what was causing these differences in implementation, whether it was about political issues or whether it was about financial issues. Next slide, please. And so we invited several contributors to look at these kinds of questions. The book is divided into 2 parts. There are 7 chapters that deal with basically country studies from Iran and Iraq, as Robin has mentioned, to the UAE, to GCC, which Faris will talk about, to the Levant, to North Africa, Morocco, to Turkey, to Egypt, etc. And it's the second part of the book features 3 chapters on cross-cutting regional issues in low carbon energy, whether it deals with governance or whether it deals with climate change and how they're responding to, say, the various negotiations at the UNFCCC, as well as looking at nuclear, which I will talk about in a little bit. Next slide, please. So what we thought was, what became of the findings of the book, I think there were 2 main themes or findings. Firstly, that politics is actually the key challenge. Obviously, there are challenges in financing. There are challenges in grid capacity or grid issues, as Robin has pointed out. Issues in financing, particularly when it comes to nuclear, but perhaps less so when it comes to the other forms of renewable energy, because there are many external financiers. The Gulf states are financing some of these renewable energy projects in MENA. So financing is much less of an issue. The technology is also much less of an issue, because wind and solar, hydro, they're all quite established technologies. So we realized that politics was actually the key challenge and the key differentiator when it comes to implementing low carbon energy in the region. And the second theme that we saw throughout this collection is that when it comes to politics, the key issue is actually the role of stakeholders, right? Robin pointed out that there are various stakeholders in Iran. You have energy projects that go ahead because they are backed by certain political stakeholders, whether it's the IRGC or other constituencies. Stakeholders can be external, the EU, for example, in their financing. There are also domestic stakeholders. There are also parastatal stakeholders like the IRGC. There are also corporate stakeholders dealing with more distributed energy or utility scale energy. There are state utilities. So there is a range of stakeholders in both the energy and the other non-energy sectors that play a role in differentiating in the scope and take-up rate of low-carbon energy in the region. Stakeholders are also differentiated by the fact that some of them facilitate low-carbon energy, and some of them actually put up quite a bit of resistance to low-carbon energy, like generator mafias in Lebanon, for example. Or in the UAE, we see the state as facilitating coal, as you mentioned, Kate. So these were some of the themes, the two themes that we saw as the key contributions, let's say, to the literature, to the policy and academic literature on low carbon energy. Over to you, Kate.
Okay, I am unmuted, I think, and my video is starting now. We have our third speaker, Faris. I'm now getting the order right. Faris, I think you have a presentation as well.
Yeah, thanks for the introduction, Raymond and Kate. It's a pleasure to be here. I've been a member of the audience at many AGSIW events, so I'm happy to kind of contribute to the discussion. Thanks to the editors as well for putting the project together. Just before I dive in, it's obviously not every day that kind of a young Gulf scholar like myself gets a captive audience in DC, so I think it bears mentioning that a lot of us in the Gulf want to kind of mention that that there are, it's not lost on us that there are more important things going on in the region at the moment, and that we stand in solidarity with Palestinians that are on strike and resisting occupation and apartheid. And now I'll move on to kind of the lighter topic of our impending climate disaster and energy transition. And I looked a little bit through the list of attendees, and there's a bunch of people who are from the energy world and people who are not. So I'm going to paint in some broad brushstrokes here. So excuse me, people who know, I don't know what LCOE or megawatt is. Excuse me. We can get to the details after in the Q&A if you find it interesting. And just to start briefly with this image, which I think is quite captures some of the themes that Li-Chen mentioned, and also that I'm going to talk about. This is a photo from the first large-scale utility project completed in Saudi in 2020. It's in Skaka and Al-Jof in the north of Saudi Arabia, and it's about 300 megawatts. So for non-energy people, that's a couple $100 million investment, and it was completed through a public tender process, but was won by a state-owned Saudi company. And it was a record low price that won at the time. And so that's an interesting combination of things going on, and we'll get to that in a second. So can we go to the next slide, please, Raymond? Just briefly, I'll give a bit of a background on how the Gulf states got here, why they were maybe late to the party, as Kate suggested, talk a little bit about why that might have happened and where things stand today, just very briefly, and then why we see this divergence. Some Gulf states are making quite a lot of progress and have ambitious plans, and some don't. So we'll talk about that as well at the end. Next slide, please. So just to start off, it's quite interesting to think about the journey that some of these Gulf states have made, starting off a decade or two ago as non-participants or even obstructionists in climate negotiations, and making their way all the way to being kind of aspiring leaders in this space. And this is something Li-Chen has written about, and others, and some of my other co-authors in the volume. But this is quite a long distance to travel in a short period of time. We saw kind of in the 90s and the early 2000s, and even in the teens, the establishment of research and development institutions in the Gulf, in Saudi, the King Abdullah University of Science and Technology, and also King Abdullah City for Renewable and Atomic Energy, which are places where material scientists and other kinds of scientists were doing some basic and also some kind of sophisticated research on renewables. The same in Muscat City in the UAE, which then became also home to IRENA, which is the UN body for renewable energy. That's the image of it there on the right. So there was some interest at the beginning, but not at the level of project development or investment on the ground. And there was also early mergers and acquisitions interest by some of these big energy players. I put two as an example. Aramco took a big stake in Solar Frontier, which is a kind of a leader in the solar module manufacturing space in Japan. They produce thin film. PDO in Oman invested in GlassPoint, which was a kind of technology player out of California that manufactured concentrated solar equipment. Both those companies are no longer either defunct or no longer at the forefront. So there was some scarring, I imagine, from that experience. But yeah, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of renewables development, states obviously had abundant resources, but made a lot of plans, especially in Saudi, a lot of very ambitious targets, but didn't go through with them. The institutions often that were used to make those targets were sidelined. So there was a bit of a credibility problem coming into the last 5 years. And one of the kind of reasons we put forth in the book and the chapter is that really questions of market design and which stakeholders were going to be involved and how the state was going to be involved were not really resolved in this early period and didn't allow for the industry to take off. And on the ground, the subsidized domestic energy market, so cheap electricity and cheap fuels, meant that organic growth, people going and installing solar on the rooftops of their factories and houses, couldn't take place either. Next slide, please. So I'll talk about this briefly, and maybe I'll touch on the difference between centralized and distributed renewables, which is something that's important to get here. At the centralized or utility scale, that image that you see there at the top to the right, which is the one used in the advertisement for this event here today, is the Maktoum Solar Park in Dubai, and that's what we call utility scale solar. So that's solar ground mounted for many rows, many kilometers, often robots doing the cleaning. And these are usually state-sponsored or organized projects, and often have the lowest cost of energy. And so the logic at the centralized and utility scale, the rentier logic at least, is kind of an odd one. When we think about oil and gas prices in the context of heavy energy importers, consumers, China say, when oil prices go up, renewables become more competitive. And that's something we saw kind of in the post-financial crisis period from 2009 to 2013, 14. And we saw a huge boom in solar and renewables development in East Asia and other places. Conversely, though, in the Gulf, when oil prices are high, there's an atmosphere of fiscal abundance, and there isn't much renewable energy going on because states are not really counting the dollars and cents, and they're not really thinking about saving money and the opportunity cost of oil that could be sold on the open market. This obviously changed in 2014 as we entered a period of low oil prices, which has persisted to this day and may be permanent for all we know. And so at the distributed scale, the image below is kind of rooftop solar from one of our projects. It's kind of a factory rooftop, and that's kind of a private sector thing mostly. It's clients deciding that their power is too expensive and that they want to invest in an alternative. And here the rentier kind of mindset or the rentier effect is that there have been persistent client and rent-seeking pressures which keep these domestic energy prices low. And despite us hearing a lot about energy price reform in the region, I'll just use the industrial tariff in Saudi Arabia as an example, but there are a few other examples. The industrial tariff in Saudi Arabia is 18 halala without VAT, which is about $4 and has remained the same for a couple of decades now, and is defended by industrial players whose profitability and business model relies on this kind of cheap subsidized energy. So that's a double rentier effect. And can we go to the next slide? So briefly, we could talk a lot about where things stand today. I chose this chart because I think it captures a lot of the hype and also a lot of the reality on the ground of what's going on. So the data really shows that things were slow at the beginning, but over the last 5 years, things have begun to pick up, and we're on the precipice of an explosion in installed capacity, or what seems like an explosion, at least in the Saudi Arabia and the UAE, less so in some of the other Gulf states. And I'll just point you to explain this chart very briefly. In the red, we see credible installation plans, and these are kind of numbers that I put together of projects that are either in the tendering process or where the tender has been awarded, so things that are going to be built in the next year or two. And the gray is installed capacity. So, and this is in megawatts. a megawatt of solar installed capacity is about $1 million of investment, give or take. So you can see that Saudi Arabia, for example, has credible installation plans that are fivefold the number of current installed capacity for renewables. So that kind of gives you an idea of the scale of growth that's happening, and also probably what's been installed in maybe 2019 alone, or 2019 and 2020 is far greater than all the installed capacity in the previous decades. So that's kind of where we sit at the moment. One thing to mention about these projects is that they're mostly developed through these competitive tenders, but they're also all, or not all, but a large majority of them have been won by state-owned companies in these competitive tenders. So that's something we can talk about later if there's interest. And that they have achieved some of the lowest prices in the world for power generation, even when compared with coal and natural gas. And the other thing to mention is on the technology side, most of these projects are solar PV, and most of them are at the utility scale. So there's not a lot of rooftop solar or biomass or wind or hydro, as is the case in Iran. This is mostly solar PV in large government-sponsored projects in the middle of the desert. There's some wind being developed in Oman and in Saudi, but not very much. And there's some distributed markets developing in the UAE and Saudi and Oman, but also not very much. Next slide, please. So, well, I'm going to summarize quite a lot of stuff here, but one of the main things that we see is that oil rents really explain the late start for the group of states, but then don't really explain the divergence between them. So the UAE is one of the highest rent states, but has made the most progress and has the most ambitious plans, whereas Qatar, for example, is also a very high rent state, but hasn't made very much progress at all. So rents don't seem to explain the difference. But when you compare the group to Jordan, for example, as was mentioned by Kate at the beginning, you see Jordan has more installed capacity even than the UAE, although it will likely be surpassed soon. And it has obviously, less resources and also a smaller grid. So what explains this divergence and what has changed? And there's a couple of points that I chose to kind of mention here. One is that the persistent and likely permanent low oil price environment has made these states, has really changed the logic of these states and permanently kind of made them, created an atmosphere of fiscal constraint. The other thing is that I think the states recognize, and globally this is the case, that now there is a better bargain to be had. Just to illustrate that, the cost of solar at a recent tender per unit of energy, per kilowatt hour, in Saudi was about $1 and it was about $4 or $5 only 3 or 4 years ago. So there's kind of an 80% decrease even in the last few years. Another kind of point that we look at in the chapter is that there's decline in rent-seeking pressures have weakened and changed in some states, and the level of state autonomy has increased. I think this is particularly visible in the UAE and Saudi, where constituencies that may have played a bigger role in policy formation in the past are no longer as important, and new constituencies and new stakeholders, including the sovereign wealth funds and firms they own that are competing in these tenders and globally, are now driving forward policy and targets. And also there's obviously the point about soft power projection, the climate change narrative, and the greening of the image, which is something Li-Chen has worked on, but is obviously important, and we can talk about that if there's interest too. And the last point is that the state capitalist institutional landscape is something that's very important. These firms owned by the PIF in the case of Saudi and Mubadala in the case of the UAE are competing in tenders in Chile and in South Africa and in Vietnam, and they're using these Gulf projects as kind of a stepping stone to gain portfolio and experience and become some of the biggest players in this space. And so that's kind of one of the features we see taking place. Can we go to the last slide, please? So I'll just end here zooming in on Saudi and talking about the Saudi national champion, which has been ACWA. ACWA was kind of a semi-private sector company that was started about 2 decades ago, a little less, by some conglomerates in Riyadh, but was also then bought into by the Public Pensions Fund, by Sanabil, and then eventually the PIF has increased its stake from 15% to 51% in the last few months. So now it is majority owned by the PIF, and ACWA is competing, as the map shows, these are projects already completed, but it's competing or under construction, competing all over the world. And this is kind of a space where state-owned enterprises compete. So ACWA Power competes against Masdar, which is the UAE state-owned company, against EDF, which is a French state-owned company. So this is a kind of space where SOEs are competing, and Saudi and the UAE are putting their candidates forward in global tenders. But it's also room for cooperation. I think this is an interesting point where we see ACWA Power's largest vehicle for owning these assets, these renewable energy assets, is now 50% owned, or I think it's 49% by the Silk Road Fund, which is the Chinese state-owned fund. So an interesting area of cooperation as well. And that these state-owned companies like ACWA Power and like Masdar are playing important roles in the kind of policy formation and market shaping process. And this is a part of a larger theme of the state placing itself and positioning itself at various points in the value chain to benefit from this transition by partnering with technology companies, by buying into technology companies on global equity markets, whether they be in the EV market, or in renewable technology, and then locally as a developer as well. So that wraps it up, I think, in terms of those themes, but happy to pick up any of these points and circle back in the Q&A.
Thank you, Faris. I'm going to go back to Li-Chen now, who's going to be talking about her nuclear chapter in the book. So over to you, Li-Chen.
Thank you very much, Kate. So I wrote on nuclear energy in Mena as one of these cross-cutting issues in the region. And could you put up the slides, please, Raymond? Thank you. And so I'd like here in the chapter to touch on three very quick points. The first one regarding, why nuclear came about in the UAE. So, and this goes to addressing a wider literature about how a niche technology actually becomes mainstream. The UAE is quite an interesting case because there was never a nuclear industry. There was no nuclear research reactor, like in Saudi Arabia, for example. So there was never a niche nuclear industry. And it was actually the state that got involved in making nuclear, bringing out from a niche to a mainstream kind of technology. If you think about, say, things like cars, you have electric cars, the niche technology at one point, versus the internal combustion engine, let's say for your Chevrolets and your GMs and BMWs. So the question is, how does a niche technology become mainstream? And so in the UAE, the answer is simply that the state stepped in. Why did the state step in as a facilitator for this niche breakout? Well, there are many reasons that have been put forth, among which, of course, is geopolitics, the Iran issue, or prestige, as say Turkey wants to have the centenary, and so the prestige of a nuclear reactor, or even energy security, which is the more mundane, as Kate would say, it's something that most of these countries need the security of energy. UAE didn't want to import any more gas, or wanted to import less gas for its power. From my point of view, I'm sorry, but I'm going to go with the more mundane explanation of energy security, and that's why nuclear was needed. It's not that geopolitics is not a consideration. It's not that prestige is not a consideration. But when you talk about driving factors, without the consideration of energy security, there would not be, it just would not be cost effective, or it just wouldn't be viable to have a nuclear power plant. So yes, geopolitics may be in the background, prestige may be in the background, but really without energy security considerations, the project would probably have not seen the light of day. So that's the first point that I was trying to make in my chapter. The second point that I was trying to make in my chapter was that there are quite a lot of strategies that the UAE and other MENA nuclear aspirants have taken to try to craft a social license for nuclear power, because nuclear power station or nuclear power will last for at least 60, or if you prolong it, even go 80 years, you actually need quite a long-term commitment when it comes to nuclear energy. So the question was, how do you craft such a long-term commitment among the society, among economic actors? We have seen nuclear plants being set up, but not even being commissioned. They were mothballed immediately in Europe, for example. So it is possible that nuclear plants can just not be in operation at all. So what kind of strategies did the UAE and other nuclear aspirants in the UAE take to craft a long-term social license? In my chapter, I talked about many different strategies to create new stakeholders where there was none in the UAE because there was no niche nuclear industry. I talked about how the state tried to preempt negative feedback from, say, the international public, because there were issues of concern of security over the nuclear proliferation. I've talked about various other strategies, but here I just want to mention two. One of them is about creating actually new stakeholders, because there, as I said, there were none in the first place in the UAE. So the state actually created nuclear education programs in the universities, in various research institutes, nuclear engineers, scholarships, for example, creating nuclear regulators, advisory boards, nuclear companies. So that's one of the strategies to try to make sure that there is a sustainable and long-term social license to operate nuclear energy in the UAE. Another strategy, which I will just briefly mention here, is about co-benefits. So in order not to alienate existing energy stakeholders with your oil and gas players, the state was very careful to emphasize that there were co-benefits of nuclear energy. So in this case, you could free up gas for export instead of using it in the power plants. And the state has continued to emphasize co-benefits even after much of Barakah has been built. You still need to emphasize these kinds of co-benefits. So, for example, Kate was talking about pink hydrogen. They've now emphasized that nuclear can play a role in producing cleaner hydrogen so that you can have a sustainable energy transition in times when there is constraints in oil and gas revenues. So some of these strategies are needed, and the UAE has done pretty well in coming up with these strategies compared to some countries, say, for example, Saudi Arabia or Iran, that have not signed various other additional protocols and other nuclear agreements to try to try to preempt negative feedback from international stakeholders. So even though many nuclear aspirants have these strategies, but they're not always well implemented. But credit goes to UAE for having actually implemented some of these strategies pretty well. I've got a final point in this chapter which I made, and that's looking at the future of nuclear energy in Mena. And I made 2 points here, and one is that the biggest impediment to nuclear energy, obviously, is the cost. Cost of nuclear is astronomical. The capital cost of is enormous, as Robin pointed out. And so, in theory, if you have small modular reactors, that will drive down the cost of nuclear energy. And that's something that Jordan is looking at. And so perhaps with lower costs, that might entice other countries to actually adopt nuclear energy. A second consideration when thinking about the future of nuclear energy would be about storage issues. So if renewable energy, like say solar and wind, can come up with viable storage solutions in form of batteries or other solutions, then that would improve their attractiveness vis-a-vis nuclear energy, which of course, it's basically 24/7. So those were my 2 points when considering about whether nuclear has a future in the region. Thank you, Kate.
Thank you. I mean, yes, one of the things that came up when I read the chapter on the UAE, the fact that coal-fired power plants are not really very good as base loads to support intermittency, because it takes about 8 hours to to start them up. And in fact, I didn't even realize that, because coal is sort of such a smaller, is sort of diminishing demand for coal. I think we're going to move on to questions because we have half an hour, but just over half an hour. And we have a question on Egypt, which we haven't really covered that much. In addition to the, okay, sorry, I thought I had done something to lose you, but there is a question that we have from Ahmed Gohar about Egypt, saying, could the panelists discuss the steps that Egypt's been taking to address climate change by diversifying its energy mix? And of course, Egypt has been getting quite a lot of financing from international finance houses, from the World Bank, from EBRD and others, and that they have the biggest, the Benban solar park, one of the biggest in the world, which is supported by the World Bank. They've adopted an integrated sustainable energy program, which I think others have done as well. Targeting 20% power generation to be based on renewables by 2022, 42% by 2035, and that it's the first MENA country to issue green bonds. And more EVs and charging stations. So perhaps one of you can actually tackle this question and talk about Egypt, which has been quite impressive as well. So, sorry. Oh, would anyone like to take Egypt? Robin, I see you.
Yeah,
yourself.
Sure. I'm happy to say a bit about that. Yeah, there is a chapter in the book by Michael Hochberg which does address Egypt. Egypt is certainly a very interesting case study. I think Egypt is interesting because it's obviously not a large oil and gas exporter. It's a big producer, particularly of gas, but not a major exporter. It has very large, obviously a very large domestic population, and so a lot of domestic energy demand. At least over the past few years, it's suffered quite significantly from energy shortages. Those have now been eased, at least for now. But that did create quite a bit of impetus on trying to find alternatives for energy supply. And that included a lot more gas-fired power generation. It included nuclear power, which has been carried out in cooperation with the Russians. But it did also include a very successful renewable energy program in solar and wind. And, Kate, you mentioned Benban as a large solar park, and there are other projects as well. And Egypt, of course, has excellent solar and in places wind resources. So Egypt is one of those interesting cases, I think, to an extent, along with Jordan and Morocco, in the region of a relatively energy poor country, at least relative to its needs, where renewables have been very important for energy security purposes. But Egypt has also played quite successfully, and Morocco, I'd say even more so, in fact, on the energy transition and climate theme, in using its renewable energy program as a way to attract financing and international support. So, there's very good energy security justification, but obviously it's easier for countries to attract external financing, particularly from European backers, when they have a clear climate goal as well. And again, I think making the comparison with Saudi Arabia, as Faris points out, that most of these are centralized utility scale projects, and the same is largely true of Egypt, right? So a strong focus on these kind of quite large centralized power plants where the government is firmly in control of the procurement process, and that is a little bit different in Jordan, where you have more of a mix of local and distributed solar and alongside the utility scale. So Egypt, yes, is certainly an interesting case, and I think Egypt and to an extent even more so Jordan are a test case really for how quickly can these countries deploy renewables, how high a share can they get in the power mix before they start running into problems of reliability and grid stability, backup, and so on, and then what do they do about it? So these countries are just starting to think ahead about when they get beyond a few single-digit level of renewables, when they start getting into the 20 and 30% levels, how do they actually cope with that? So those are important test cases for that as well. So yes, Egypt is an important an interesting case. I think illustrates the economic and the energy security rationale, but also it's understandable why in Egypt's political system, why the renewable energy program has proceeded in the way that it has.
Very sensitive mouse. And a cat who's meowing next door. But anyway, it's a fact that we haven't really maybe mentioned, is that despite the fact that renewables form a very small share of power generation in the region as a whole, the costs, the low costs that we've seen have actually had an impact globally, haven't they? I mean, I may be wrong, but I think the region did help bring down the cost of solar, particularly solar PV. Faris, you have been complimented for your really brilliant presentation. Somebody is asking, I have a question from Marcus Janovic Trench, who says, the UAE and Saudi governments have been talking a lot about hydrogen. Is this just noise, or is it part of serious policy initiatives?
Thanks for the compliment and the question. I think maybe Li-Chen will be able to speak a bit more about this, but I'll just touch on it briefly. And I don't think it's just noise. Maybe some of it is noise, but I think some of the kind of conventional energy players in the region think that a lot of their infrastructure that was well built for gas and oil can be, and the expertise of their state-owned oil companies can play a large role in a global hydrogen market. And I think that does make some sense. But it really depends also on global trends and whether there's an uptick in hydrogen as a transport fuel and as an industrial fuel. So it's a bet that's being placed. I think they are taking steps to do that, but whether it plays out well, it's difficult to say.
Yeah, and you need the infrastructure, and also if you're going to be producing it from gas rather than renewables, then you're going to need CCS as well, carbon capture and storage, in order to, because there's more emphasis now on low carbon or zero carbon gas. So we also, does anybody else, any of our other speakers want to say anything on hydrogen, or should we move on to the next question? Li-Chen, Robin, you've written about hydrogen? No, we'll move on. Okay, we have another question on that says, to what extent does regime type matter, taking Kingdom Saudi Arabia and the UAE as cases? What is the importance of both countries having a rather one-man leadership, Mohammed bin Salman, Mohammed bin Zayed, in speeding up the alternative energy projects? This is Paul Arts from the University of Amsterdam asking.
I can take that question. Thank you for the question, Paul. So yes, to an extent, regime type does matter when it comes to accelerating the low carbon energy process. Obviously, if you've got a more top-down system that can drive through some of these projects much more easily and with much less resistance. But at the same time, I mean, if you look at Jordan has done very well in terms of its renewable energy uptake, but yet it's, you really wouldn't say it's in a one-man system the same way as with MBZ and MBS. So, and that's because, Jordan has a real need for that. And I think there's quite a lot of financing that's coming in for that. And they've opened themselves up to accepting this financing. So that also has a role to play. It's not just about having a one-man leadership system. Another example I can point you to is Morocco. Again, Morocco's got quite a high uptake of especially hydropower and also of solar. And again, you won't exactly say that it's in the same political leadership style as in Saudi Arabia and UAE, yet it has done quite well in terms of its uptake of renewable energy. So yes, to an extent, regime type does play a role. Again, if you look at Egypt, so Egypt has probably more of the same political leadership style as UAE and Saudi Arabia, yet its nuclear energy program has not gone off to a very quick start, and it has come up against opposition within some parts of civil society on and off. So yes, regime type does matter to extent, but it's not the full picture there. Thank you.
Stay with me because I think this is also one for you on nuclear. We have Leslie Bellis asking, how does the use of nuclear power impact water usage and production? I don't know if this refers to water cooling or just water.
Thank you for your question, Leslie. Yes, so nuclear power plants do suck up, as you mentioned, Kate, quite a lot of water because of cooling. So that's one consideration, which is why nuclear plants are, always built near large bodies of water that are easily accessed. So in UAE's case, it's built, on the coast near Baraka. Of course, you can always pipe in water to an inland power plant, but that's less. It's more costly. It's going to add to the already astronomical cost of nuclear power stations. So yes, that the lack of water in the Middle East doesn't. It's not going to preclude that, because if you're looking at small modular reactors, they have less of a water need. So in that sense, that kind of takes care of one of the equations. But also don't forget that other kinds of low carbon energy, like solar plants, also, they could require, they've got water needs as well. Water is quite a big fixture in quite a lot of these low carbon energy systems.
Thank you. We also now have a question from Clementine Leonard saying, which MENA countries are lagging behind regarding energy transition. I think we've sort of covered this, but maybe somebody can take this question as to which MENA countries are lagging behind and why.
Yes, I think that's an interesting question, and it really relates to some of the issues we've touched before. And the regime type is an important one, but not the only one. Look, I think there are some countries in the region which have a very obvious and desperate need for more energy, and in particular renewables, and yet haven't done anything. Lebanon stands out as one. Terrible situation with power supply, using when they can get expensive oil for fuel, and renewables, particularly solar, would be highly applicable, and yet almost nothing has happened. Tunisia is another one. Again, very good conditions for solar power in Tunisia. Almost nothing done. And those are, of course, a couple of countries that aren't major hydrocarbon producers and exporters. But then you've got Algeria, which has a very large, extensive territory with a lot of great solar potential, a big oil and gas exporter, and also has done almost nothing in renewables. There's an interesting kind of contrast there. I think you've got a couple of more democratic countries and then a more autocratic one. And they're in different positions as regards hydrocarbon exports and production, and yet they've both struggled, or all three of them have struggled to get anywhere on renewables. And I touched on some of the reasons why Iraq also has done very little. It's a complicated story. And then you've got some countries in the Gulf. Bahrain again would seem like a very good case for renewables, has done very little, and Kuwait, where it's really Kuwait's a struggle to get a lot of energy projects moving, not just in the renewable sector, but in oil and gas as well, with political differences and opposition. So I think the politics of each country is very much important, and the policy priorities. When we talked about the question earlier, is it the kind of the one man, one person rule that is important? In some of the countries, yes, and I think for the case of the UAE. I wanted to draw attention not only to Mohammed bin Zayed, but also to Mohammed bin Rashid, of course, in Dubai, who has very much been the supporter of solar power in Dubai. And that almost kind of competitiveness within the country has been important, I think, in Dubai, showing how well it could do in solar, that has given the encouragement to Abu Dhabi to move forward as well. But then you've got a country like Qatar, also a very top-down system, even more so perhaps, and yet only very recently did it start thinking seriously about renewables. So, it's not as simple as one person rule, but it's, what is that person interested in? And if at a certain time they're not interested in renewables, then of course nothing happens.
But I mean, one has to mention that Qatar is also now quite aware of the need to sort of decarbonize its gas, because it is the biggest exporter of LNG, and there is more pressure now to to incorporate CCS in their new projects. And staying on
indeed, and that's come up over the past year, yeah. And I think you could pick out that Qatar and Oman, as countries that were very slow to come to renewables, but now maybe the light bulb has come on.
And also, when we talk about finances, there are certain countries like the UAE which can self-finance, but then you have countries like Egypt and Morocco which have been getting a lot of institutional funding for their solar projects. And that, I think, is also one of the reasons why we see some moving faster than others. So staying on solar, Jeffrey Steiner asks, what happens to solar farms when the solar panels wear out? What's the general cost of recycling, and is that included in the daily energy price? And of course, this whole recycling issue comes up with batteries for storage and other bits and pieces of the renewables supply chain. So what happens when?
Maybe I'll tackle that briefly, but before that, I wanted to kind of comment on the last question, and I'll circle back if you don't mind, Kate.
Yeah, sure.
One of the interesting things that we can see in the Gulf, so as a group, the Gulf states definitely late compared to other countries in the similar kind of income bracket, if you want to use that as a point of comparison. But between the states, Robin was right to point out the difference between Qatar and Kuwait, for example, on the one hand, which have the resources to develop the solar, but maybe haven't done that. And one of the things that we do notice is that both in the case of Qatar and Kuwait, the task of developing renewables was given to their national oil company, which seems to be a strategy that institutionally doesn't work. Institutionally, the states that have done well and have moved forward have been states that have developed an institutional landscape and clarified the roles of these stakeholders better. And I think getting oil companies to lead the energy transition and the renewable, or even state utilities, seems to be something that kind of slows down the process. So the UAE and Saudi have made some progress to creating institutions that are separate from the oil and gas sector that are charged with the energy transition. So that's one thing to mention. On the issue of kind of solar panels and what happens to them 20 years down the line. So the way these projects tend to work is that modules from kind of the top tier module manufacturers come with 20, 25, even 30-year power production guarantees. So they're covered by warranty to produce power according to a schedule. And even at the end of that period, they continue to produce power, but are no longer guaranteed by the manufacturer. So they still have some retained value. And there are different ways of projecting this and understanding it. But a lot of it will also depend on how quickly the technology evolves. So if you install solar on your rooftop, but within 10 years, there are modules that are 3 times or twice as dense and as powerful, then it won't make sense to keep them. So it depends on really the business model. And there is kind of a global ecosystem of recycling that is starting to get going, but really most of the solar capacity that's been installed globally has not even come close to 20 years. And so this is something that has to develop in the next decades.
So another speaker, Anne Moyson, is asking us to look forward 20 years and to see how do we see energy more broadly looking in the region, more collaboration among countries, how with the Abraham Accords does Israel play a constructive role. And in fact, I just wrote something today about the Mubadala's plan to actually buy into an offshore Israeli gas field, which is also one of the, which has been cited by the UAE as hopefully integrating, leading to more integration between Jordan, Egypt, the rest of North Africa and elsewhere in the Gulf. We're not going to touch on the politics at the moment because we're purely talking about energy, but do we actually see the Abraham Accords as leading to a more to more integration within the region, assuming that we see less tension in? Does anybody, is there a sort of peace dividend from the Abraham Accords that is going to be reflected in energy relations within the Middle East?
Well, I think that there is going to be, it really depends on, as you say, peace, right? But assuming that there is, I think that there is quite good chances that there will be cooperation, for example, in say hydrocarbons, right? And the hydrocarbon sector, that there is some cooperation. But I think more interestingly would be obviously the low carbon energy sector, where, with Israel's lead in technologies, I think that could definitely be something that the UAE looks for. But also outside of the Abraham Accords, I think that the Gulf states are financing quite a lot of the low carbon energy projects in the Middle East already. And they could, as Robin had written in his recent report on hydrogen, the UAE could also be looking to invest in some of the green or multicolored hydrogen projects in the region. So it's not just the prospects of the Abraham Accords, which seems to be a bit more hydrocarbon driven at the moment, but with prospects for low carbon energy. But outside of that, I think that there is also scope for the Gulf states to do more in the region, but also outside the region. Let's say if we look at Central Asia, for example, that's also where they are investing. So I think, yes, quite a lot of opportunities in the future.
Thank you, Li-Chen. I see David Ottaway, very old friend, I hope he's still online, asking what happened to Saudi plans to build nuclear power plants. I think at one point Saudi Arabia had plans to build quite a few nuclear reactors dotted around the country. So is that likely to happen?
Maybe I'll touch on it briefly and pass on to Li-Chen, who probably knows a bit more about this than I do. But hello, David. I worked for David as a research assistant back in the day, so I hope he is still around, and for Marina. So there's a test kind of research reactor based in Riyadh, and there have been kind of on and off plans to develop a third generation Korean reactor, but they have stalled, and I think maybe Li-Chen is in a better place to talk about where they are at the moment, because I haven't heard of the project in quite some time.
Yep. Li-Chen, over to you.
I agree with Faris that they have stalled. And I've asked some of my friends over in Saudi Arabia what's happened to it. And it seems that it's all gone very, very quiet. Now the big thing now obviously is the hydrogen. So that's something that they're playing up. Something that's also gone very quiet would be the solar, what was it, the mega solar SoftBank or Vision Fund, that solar, the 200 million big solar plant, that one has also gone very quiet. So right now, the emphasis is definitely, on hydrogen and on carbon capture, the carbon economy.
Well, they have actually exported, Saudi Arabia has exported one blue ammonia to Japan. And that sort of answers the next question that came in about green hydrogen. Oisin Qamar, sorry, I sometimes get it wrong. So what would it take for green hydrogen to become commercially viable, and what sort of timeline is realistic?
Yes, I'll take this one. I mean, look at, at the moment, so-called blue hydrogen from fossil fuels with carbon capture and storage, it cost vary, quite widely. But let's say, kind of round figures. If we're looking at grey hydrogen, so hydrogen from fossil fuels with CO2 emissions, can be produced perhaps around $1 or $1.50 per kilogram, and then blue hydrogen with carbon capture and storage in $1.50 to $2.50 range. Green hydrogen very much depends on where you are and what kind of renewables you're using to power it, but substantially more expensive, $4 to $5 a kilo plus. But there are significant hopes to bring that down by reducing the cost of renewables, but particularly reducing the cost of electrolyzers, the equipment that actually does the electrolysis of water to produce hydrogen. And there are a lot of hopes that this will follow the pattern of renewable energy, solar panels, and the cost will drop dramatically as the industry scales up. And you'll see some projections that green hydrogen could be cost competitive by 2030 or so. I suspect it may be somewhat longer. Yeah. But because of this, there's obviously a lot of interest from the Gulf, and particularly Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Oman to date in both blue and green hydrogen. Different entities being involved in the blue versus the green. I guess the general idea would be blue will come first and be lower cost and larger scale initially, and then hopefully green will pick up over time. But yes, it is an important export, potential future export industry, something of a replacement for oil and gas exports. But I think we should be realistic that the size of the hydrogen market and the rents it will generate will be nothing like to the scale of oil and gas rents. So it's an important new industry. It could be a very important one for the Gulf and for other Middle Eastern countries, North Africa as well. But it is absolutely not a replacement as a pillar of the economy for oil and gas.
I mean, some people see it as a sort of turning into a tradable commodity like LNG, but that's quite a long way away. And also, when I look at the numbers, when I look at the percentage of hydrogen in the global energy mix, even in the most ambitious targets, it's still going to be quite small, and it has to grow from a very, very small share at the moment to
Yeah.
I mean, it has to grow enormously in order to have even a small share in the global energy mix.
Yes, and I think your comparison there, Kate, to LNG is a good one, because look, there's only really one country in the region which really makes a living off LNG, which is Qatar. If you talk about the others, the UAE, Oman, the others, LNG is useful for sure. It's valuable, but it's far from a pillar of the economy in its own right.
And it sort of brings us to the next question by Chia Sun, who asks us, the biggest importer from Mena, what role can China play in the Mena energy transition? Which is interesting, considering that China does produce most of the world's PVs and metals and minerals for batteries. So what role can they play? Are they playing a role in the transition, apart from supplying the PV, the solar panels?
Well, I think apart, as you said, Kate, apart from supplying the solar panels, which is a big thing because they are the lowest cost, the biggest supplier, that's already a big role. I think some of them are also trying to set up manufacturing facilities in the region itself, because there are some of these local content requirements coming up in Saudi as well as in Oman. So that will contribute to local employment requirements. So that's another role that they can play. Another role that I see is also in financing. So you mentioned the coal plant in Dubai. That's financed by the Chinese and the Circle Fund. Obviously, as Faris mentioned, the PIF, the Aqua Power, and the Chinese also have a share in that. So, financing-wise, the Chinese banks, Chinese companies are all playing a very big role in that. So that's finance, that's jobs, and that's the equipment, the solar panels itself. Definitely a very big role.
It's very incongruous, though, isn't it? Because the amount of particulates, I mean, particularly in a place like the UAE, which has a lot of dust flying around, and the amount of particulates that you get from emissions by burning coal without CCS, which I understand the Dubai plant doesn't have any strategy to include a sort of carbon capture and storage facility. That certainly runs counter to the sort of the environmental credentials of the UAE, and there's more coming, I understand, from reading that chapter in your book. No? Okay. We'll move on to another friend and former IEA colleague, Kamal Ben Nasser, who asks, what is MENA's low zero carbon export strategy? The region is obviously a powerhouse in exporting oil and gas, but as the world moves to decarbonize, those fuels fall out of favor. What is MENA doing to maintain its position as a strong exporter? Are there countries leading the way or designing a zero carbon fuel export strategy? And if so, what vectors are they targeting to export? Who would like to take this one?
I can talk briefly about power export, and there's quite a lot of excitement, I think, over the last 2 years and discussions at kind of the leadership level in Saudi about the prospect of, for example, exporting power to Iraq. Robin discussed and touched briefly on the power outages and the problems in the power sector in Iraq, and so there is this ambition kind of fueled and backed by these. Initially, it was meant to be, in the same discussion as the projects that were to emerge from the SoftBank Vision Fund in Saudi. Now, the way it seems to be playing out is that the PIF itself is taking on a large percentage of the projects in Saudi. 70% is the number that we've heard, and that they will develop these. They will be the primary developer of these projects, and that these projects will be strategically positioned in Saudi and within the grid to enable exports to countries like Iraq. So that seems like a pretty smart strategy. I don't know how long Iraq will be happy to take that power. Eventually, we hope, and one would hope, that they're able to kind of get their industry up on its feet, and they have plenty of resource. But that's one kind of strategy that's quite interesting, and that's piqued a lot of interest in the region. Maybe my colleagues can speak more about the export of other low carbon fuels.
I'll just chime in here. So yes, definitely, none of the countries in the region have actually have a net zero goal. Correct me if I'm wrong, Robin, but none of them have this goal. They have an ambition to be low, not net zero, but very low, near to zero. So that would come from, say, whether it's carbon capture or whether methane emissions, doing something to lower methane emissions levels. So there are these kinds of goals. They have their zero flaring aims, etc. So there are these kinds of attempts at trying to, as I would say, buy a social license for the continuation to export hydrocarbons. So that's their attempt. But as for net zero, we'll wait to hear and see whether any of them would jump into the bandwagon.
And of course, Saudi Arabia does have plans, both Saudi Arabia and the UAE, with carbon capture and storage. The circular carbon economy is very much part of this whole, the sort of transition, the move to transition to lower carbon exports, because they are going to come under more and more pressure, and not just the offer for oil, but gas. And now we're being told by Mr. Arts again, how can we not talk about politics in the context of the Abraham Accords? I think we answered that question, and that there is, we have seen some investments, and it's not something that we really, really want to get into at the moment, but I think we've answered the question. And Faris is being asked by David Wolf to comment on the importance of the Abu Dhabi government appointing Sultan Jaber as CEO of ADNOC, since he led Masdar, and how that affects Abu Dhabi's commitments to alternative energy. Or maybe Robin or Faris.
Yeah, I've heard the news, but I don't think I'm well placed to comment.
Yeah.
Maybe can chime in.
Yeah, Robin, you live in the UAE.
Yeah. Sure. Well, look, I think the thing there is that Dr. Sultan is very much one of Mohammed bin Zayed's go-to men. He's very forceful and dynamic character, and therefore has taken on some of these key roles. Not only was he leading Masdar in its early years, but also he was the envoy to Egypt when the UAE was engaging particularly with the new Egyptian government, and also the climate change envoy. So he tends to just pick up these important roles. And his mandate at ADNOC, I think, was very much to shake it up with what had been quite a stuffy state-owned company, quite conservative, to try and bring it into a new era and make it much more effective, more value creating, more profitable, and more influential, driving the whole domestic economy. And that is obviously mostly about oil and gas, but obviously that has still a lot of connections to low carbon energy, low carbon footprint, the hydrogen strategy, CCS, and so on. So I think it's not so much that he came from Masdar and therefore he has a mindset that he wants to do renewables everywhere or low carbon energy, but more that that he has this kind of role as a disruptor and a shaker up. I think that's why I think he's been particularly important at ADNOC, and no doubt that ADNOC is a dramatically different place now from what it was 7 years ago.
Mm-hmm. And the last question that we have a little bit of time for, but I think we've kind of answered it, from Kim Note, who says, how realistic are Saudi Arabia's ambitious plans for the transition to solar energy? I think we have actually covered this, and they are.
Yeah, I think they're probably more realistic than the ones that have been made in the past, particularly because the institutional landscape has changed. And we have these players that are set to benefit from this transition and are participating in kind of the policy formation and also in the kind of formation of these targets, making sure that they're attainable. And so I think this time does feel a little bit different, but we'll have to wait and see.
Thank you very much. And we've answered all the questions and we are on time. So I'm going to thank you all. It's been a fascinating discussion. And I'm not just saying this. One of the, well, not the questions, one of the comments that came in was that it was an excellent discussion, one of the best that they've heard. So it's all thanks to you. And I urge everybody to go and buy the book, because you're not going to find a lot of the information that's in it anywhere else. And I assure you, I look everywhere because, you know, not even the IEA with its, you know, with all the reports it's issuing almost on a daily basis, you really won't find that much on the MENA region. There was a focus on Morocco, and I was involved in that a few years back. But that's because Morocco is the only Arab country that is actually an association country of the IEA, but the rest of it is really, and I'm going to pour into it and hopefully use a lot of the information. So I do urge you to buy it. It is a unique volume of very, very interesting information and useful. So Raymond, do you want to close it off?
Thanks so much, Kate. Thank you all for joining us. Special thanks to our speakers and to our moderator for making the time to join us today and sharing these incredible insights. I'm really happy that we're able to contribute to this important conversation, and we'll continue doing so through future programs and publications. And I urge you to go on our website, agsiw.org, look for our upcoming events, and look at the contributions of some of our speakers as well, including Robin, Li-Chen, Kate, hopefully Faris in the future as well, as we address this topic in more detail. So thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you at our upcoming events. Thank you.